And Ash, while we're waiting, did you want to share your own slides, or do you want me to share your slides? Either way is fine with me.
I can share my slides if that's okay.
Yep, of course.
You know, I don't think I've tried doing this with Meet Echo, so.
It's kind of like everything else. You just have to find the right button. So we'll come to that in a minute. All right, let's go ahead and get started. We have, I guess, 71 people in the room. That seems roughly about right. So welcome to the Danish BOF, the second Danish BOF, really. This is IETF 111. We had one at 110 as well. It is July, and we are not in San Francisco. The agenda, we did modify it a little bit if somebody looked at the agenda before today. Basically, we had the note, well, we had the working group story so far, which is really where we are with respect to BOF 2. And then we're going to repeat portions of the technology pitch, you know, where the problem space is, and Ash will go over that for a good 20 minutes or so with some, it's a little bit shorter than last time, and some new examples that I think hopefully more clearly spell out exactly what we're aiming for here. And then we'll talk about the current state of chartering and where that is, and we'll come back to that at the time. And then we'll have an open mic and any other business, which will include, are there enough participants in order to actually carry this work forward? And that's where we really need to hear from people. One of the reasons why we are having the second BOF is because we really didn't get enough responses for people that agreed that the charter was something that they'd be interested in working on, or at least seeing accomplished. This is the note. Well, most people probably already know about it. It basically says you should contact a lawyer if you don't understand it. Administrativia, there's a CoMD for note-taking, and Michael is trying to take notes in via Jabberscribe. Please, hopefully, if you could help him out, that would be highly beneficial. This probably won't require a huge amount of notes, so it's an easy one to take up if you're new to note-taking and want to just see what it's like, and CoMD is a whole lot of fun to play with. Meet Echo will automatically do blue sheets, so there's nothing to sign. And Jabber is at that Jabber console, or you can click on the little talk button on Meet Echo, which has Jabber nicely integrated. If you want something relayed and you are not going to get into the queue with respect to pushing the mic want to talk button, please do prefix your comments with Mike : so if you want it relayed by Michael as the Jabber scribe. So the story so far, where we are, is we had a non-working group BOF formatting in IETF 110, and the reason it was non-working group formatting is we didn't have a charter yet. So the proponents who are sort of the ones that keyed up with this idea, we just hadn't gotten around to writing a charter. And it looked like the problem was well understood last time. There was generally a lack of disagreement or, you know, agreement. There wasn't a whole lot of discussion. There was a general consensus that it did look like a good problem to tackle, but the discussion occurred later when we started putting the charter up in the last couple of months. It was originally written in April and May, and it's been trimmed a lot after various people had terminology issues and trying to very clearly spell out exactly what problem space we're trying to tackle. Yeah, Robin, please do go help Michael. That'd be helpful if you can. So the revised charter did not get a lot of agreement or disagreement. It was sort of, you know, silent, and that is where we really need to hear from everybody. So I'll reiterate that a few times today. If we don't hear enough interest, then the IESG will probably make the decision not to have a working group. So if you're interested in this space, you know, regardless of whether you want to actually you know, participate actively and write text, or if you just want to review, or if you're just thinking it's a good problem to be solved, we want to hear from you at the end of the day. So with that, we're not going to go into the charter now. So this is the charter slides are next, and we'll break apart the charter later. But for now, we're actually going to turn it over to Ash, who is going to give a background presentation on, you know, where we are from the technology pitch point of view. So Ash. You can request, you have to push the request share screen button, I think, and then I approve you.
Okay. Share preloaded slides.
Yeah, he wants to run it himself, though.
Okay.
Let's
We have infinite recursion, so that's a good step in the right direction.
Right. All right, how's that? Oh,
that looks good. You're not on slide 1, but yep. All right, off to you.
Perfect. All right, so I'm going to try and limit this to about 20 minutes so we have plenty of time to talk about the charter. There's some technical detail in here that we can go back and reference if we need, but some of the deeper technical slides we may gloss over. So to start, let's define the problem space. The challenges that we see in the IoT ecosystem is that we have private PKI everywhere, and establishing trust between entities credentialed by private PKI is really challenging when you start traversing those PKI domains. There are really no technical controls to prevent, one PKI from, naming its entities, to conflict with what you find in another PKI. And discovery APIs for certification authorities for CA and entity certificates are oftentimes proprietary. And so you end up with what we kind of feel is an over-consolidation, and that's to prevent naming collisions and ease trust challenges where you just onboard everything to the same organizational PKI. That's pretty limiting. And so what we need, private PKI needs a broadly useful lookup mechanism. And specifically, we need that lookup mechanism to work well across private PKI to enable mutual TLS authentication between entities represented by different PKI. It needs to prevent naming collisions. Ideally, it will also make credential rotation easier, and it should work well for constrained platforms because we're talking about IoT and, storage, in megabytes and very limited compute power. And so what we want to do is to create, safe bridges between, what you may refer to these as islands of trust or PKI domains. Digging into the islands of trust problem. So the CA bundle is what makes web PKI work well. Without the CA bundle, then web browsing would really be pretty painful. And so that's really what we have for client identity in IoT. It's just a bunch of private PKI, and it's not, particularly interoperable from a trust standpoint. We really don't want to move, toward getting everything attached to web PKI for client identity. It wasn't really built for that, and that brings a whole host of other problems. And so how do we otherwise get agreement on IoT roots of trust? And so what we have now is that ends up being, a distribution of CA certs or consolidation onto the same organizational PKI. Because when you have multiple PKI, again, you have naming collisions and consolidation sometimes favored. And once you have the entire organization on the same trust island, then getting communication or establishing trust across organizations, from machine to machine becomes difficult. So what we end up with are suboptimal information flows, right? So this, here's a diagram of a sensor and an actuator participating in the same activity, but their information flow goes up to a hosted platform because each of those has an identity issued by different PKI. And so this is sort of like what you see, what we used to refer to in telecom as tromboning, where you have, two endpoints that are communicating through a suboptimal path. What we want to get to is having sensors and actuators being able to communicate directly, especially if they're on the same network segment, and then only go to the platform for, platform necessary communication. So let's talk about initial work areas for this effort. This is one of the slides we're going to skip and go back to if we need to go into detail. TLS client authentication with Dane. The original drafts were developed in mid-2015 by Schumann and Victor, and we refreshed those later last year to sort of encompass what we think is a really good way to bring this into the IoT space. The target use cases for this are IoT and SMTP transport security, these two drafts. One of them covers, presenting a client certificate using DANE TLSA records, and the other draft covers, changes to the TLS protocol to enable DANE client authentication. And so the protocol summary, the client has a DNS name, at that, TLSA records, represented in DNS at that name, carry a public key. The device has the private key, and a certificate can be found in DNS that binds the public key to the domain name. Also support for using a raw public key. The TLS server sends a request message, in the handshake, and then when it gets the response, it unpacks that PKI, that certificate, and pulls the entity name out of the certificate, uses that to authenticate, what's presented in DNS at that entity name. The TLS extension, sort of going into more into the specifics, we have a way of the client needs to be able to signal to the server that it intends to authenticate using DANE. And then the server, when it requests that, when it gets the response from the client, and TLS 1.3, this is carried in the encryption in an already established encrypted session. With TLS 1.2, there are some privacy considerations that we should consider. We propose a couple of different naming conventions. They are not exclusive, and they actually work together. The first one we'll talk about is a service-specific client identity, and that's where you have perhaps multiple identities associated with the same entity. And one of those in this, as represented on the slide, might be an SMTP client. There may be multiple certificates or public key identities associated with relay1.example.com. Looking at specifically the IoT use case here, we have the organizational domain and the device name separated by an underscore device label. And what this allows us to do is it allows us to delegate that, because we expect that you're going to want to tie that DNS zone to a certification authority, right, via that proprietary API, and then allow DNS to become that lookup mechanism for that private PKI that's managed in another system. That carries certain security considerations. You don't necessarily want to, to have that sort of, other DNS zones may not have that kind of churn, right? And so being able to have that delegation point gives us something visual where we can see that, okay, we have devices under this point in the DNS tree. It prevents, web PKI from issuing recognized PKI to entities represented under that point, because there's an underscore label. And it sort of gives us a way of kind of compartmentalizing, risk in the case of compromise. And this is what a record might look like. So this would be, a sensor device with a, with its public key hash represented in a TLSA record. I'm going to skip some of these more detailed slides. And so what we hope to get out of this is to simplify, PKI management. You should be able to rotate your own client certificates when you want via DNS, and TTL is really the only delay there. And then, when you start looking at attribution for client authentication, it becomes a lot easier because you have a DNS name that you can work from. And, you can tie that to a real world entity or organization behind the DNS name and who owns it. So trust can happen like this. Vendor 1 and vendor 2 can then, cross communicate. You just need to describe trust using DNS names, and you take the whole needing to contextualize using, private PKI out of it. An architecture document is also proposed. And the architecture doc describes how DANE device identity fits into various use cases. This is not, the scope for this document is not as well defined as the existing drafts, for client identity and client certificate. The TLS updates So I expect that we'll have some discussion on this in a few minutes. But some of the topics that we would propose for this is, of course, we need to have some, terminology and pull what we can from other existing documents, like the IoT Edge Computing document, show how we, this design overlaps and enables those others. There are certain use cases that we can get immediate benefit from. So ETLS, RADSEC, things where being able to use TLS client certificates can be enabling for other standards. Decoupled application authentication. So there's in our last BOF session, we had a great series of slides from that describes how some of the challenges in establishing trust between components in the LoRaWAN broader application ecosystem could be simplified if we could just use DANE. And of course, the client server authentication, which is what we're talking about here, how this might fit into, how does a TLS authentication middleware component behave? And, beyond that, what is it, how does it communicate? Or, maybe what headers would it use to communicate to the application behind it, who has performed TLS client authentication using DANE. There's an object security use case which we could include, or we could exclude and just update the document if we decide to recharter to cover that. And then there's sort of the outstanding question of, would this be better as an update to 7671, or should this be a separate document? So covering sort of a brief use case of cloud service authentication. The desired behavior is, for this application, we want to use supplier provisioned DANE identities for TLS authentication. And this would allow us to pick best of breed suppliers and use supplier issued PKI identities safely. The challenges that we hope to mitigate are, onboarding all of your manufacturer CA certs. If you want to use supplier issued PKI, then you have to manage those individual supplier CA certificates in whatever application they're authenticating against. That's sort of a challenge. Authorization becomes complicated because as you extract those names from certificates, they also have to be presented to the application within the context of the PKI that authenticated them. And so that presents some challenges as well, especially with cross CA impersonation. That's why you have to really get that right. With DANE client identity, the client name is bound to a DNS name, and you don't have to onboard devices to an organizational PKI. Authenticating middleware can then just use DNS to authenticate those client entities, and you don't have to make sure that that authenticating middleware has access to all of those trust anchors, from the various PKI that you might have in a traditional client auth situation. And the client identity can be represented by the authenticating middleware to the application behind it using HTTP headers. So diagrams to illustrate this. With traditional PKI, what you might have is in this example, say there's a company called Fleet.example, and Fleet.example, are owners and operators of taxi services as well as commercial vehicles. And as they receive new vehicles from MFR.example, and those new vehicles already contain dash cams with PKI identity from the manufacturer. And then they may send some vehicles off to taxi.example for customization. And then they come back from taxi.example with dash cams with their own PKI. But in order to, eliminate the possibility of naming collision and the challenges of managing multiple PKI with storage.example, who manages all of their uploaded dashcam videos, they onboard to their own PKI through whatever process. And that represents some overhead, some time consumed that we think that we can eliminate in a lot of use cases. The challenges with this, in addition to the time that it takes, the time and effort and automation that it takes to do that private PKI onboarding process, On the API side of storage.example, you also have the challenge of when you authenticate those entities, you have to authenticate those clients within the context of their own PKI, and associating those, not just the entity name, but the PKI with the customer account. And in a multi-tenant platform, this can get a little bit complicated. Let's look at the same sort of use case through the lens of using DANE for mutual authentication. So API.storage.example, it has a DANE record. And so the devices can use that to authenticate it as a server. If the devices come with, shipped from the manufacturer, with immediately usable DANE identities, then you don't have to onboard these to an organizational PKI. If you trust the manufacturer to issue those, those device certificates, securely, then you can take those, and it becomes a matter of, from the implementer's perspective, they just need to keep up to date a list of the devices allowed to upload to their account at api.storage.example. And api.storage.example, when it's authenticating those clients, really only has to perform the action of authenticating against those DANE DNS records, and it doesn't have to have all of that private PKI accessible to authenticate clients. And so the authenticating middleware within API, fronting api.storage.example, we think can be simplified, so it becomes easier for onboarding for fleet.example, and the application code, ideally on api.storage.example, becomes a lot easier too. Again, scope of work, DANE for client identity. We discussed this a few minutes ago, and those two are currently published, and we've iterated on those a few times. We have not published a draft yet for the architecture document. And then the appendix and links, these will be accessible later. So that's what I've got, and I can hand this back to Wes.
Okay, great.
Unless we have questions, we'd like to revisit any of the slides.
Yep. So I'm going to shift to my slides though, so we can look at the charter text. But other than that, we should, or I can pull yours up again too if people want to dive in. I guess the first thing to do is, does anybody have clarifying questions for Ash? Right. So let's not go into this is the wrong approach, this is the right approach, this use case is wrong, my use case is better, this is the wrong technology. I only want to know, is there clarifying questions of stuff that people didn't understand? We'll get to the rest of it in a minute. I see it said Ben Schwartz joined the queue, but I think you went away, Ben, because I don't, I need to go upward. There we go. Victor, go ahead.
Sure. I hope it's a clarifying question. I'm wondering whether any of the manufacturers are actually inclined or interested or have plans to do anything like this. What's the story with, is this going to happen? And the other question I have is, on the client side, how likely is it that people will expect manufacturers of devices to be around in the long term to continue to present their DANE, records in their zones, or is this just an onboarding technology to get initially, reparented into a private PKI on the consumer side? Kind of clarify, where are we going with this, if you like, so I think it's kind of a clarifying question. I'm not challenging the use case as such.
Those are really good questions.
Ash, go ahead.
So I would say that, specifically the concerns about, representing an identity if a company goes out of business, that's definitely a valid concern. And you may not, while we talk about the simplification that can come from, supplier issued PKI, that it may make sense also to still, have that onboarded for, to an organization wanting to represent their own identities. But I would think that, if a manufacturer goes out of business and they're also not issuing firmware updates, then there are other concerns that come along with that. But no, I think it's a valid question, and I think that we could definitely represent that. You know, I think the architecture document would probably be a pretty good place for us to represent that. You had a second question, and I'm sorry, it skips my mind. What was your first question, Victor?
Was who was going to be implementing stuff too, right? Is there definite use cases where I guess there are companies that are planning on using this technology? And to
Yes.
some extent, yes. Okay. So to some extent, I think we can take that post charter when we try and figure out, is there people in this space that want to participate? And one of the questions for participation is, are there people in the space that want to do implementation? So we will come back to that later. That's a valid question, Victor, but let's table that for the moment. All right, Ben?
Hi, Ben Schwartz, Google. So my question is the benefit of this arrangement essentially that it allows you to securely give devices human readable names? Because it seems to me that if you say that it seems to me that the name of a device always has to be provisioned securely out of band. We don't address how it is. Nothing here addresses how you learn the name of a device. And so if the name of the device were, for example, a public key fingerprint, then we would not have any of this PKI question at all. You could just verify the device's certificate against that public key fingerprint. But that's not very user-friendly in cases where those names are ever exposed to users or operators. So is the benefit of this system that it allows us to use human-readable domain names as device identifiers?
That is one benefit, but another benefit, sort of speaking to your use case, is that if your, if your public key identifier is also the name of the device being identified, then you can't rotate that public key without also changing the name of the device. And so, if a policy is bound to a device name, and the device name is the public key ID, then certificate or credential rotation becomes kind of difficult.
Okay, thank you.
Muted, Wes, and you're probably trying to tell the next participant to go ahead.
Yeah, so if Carrie Lynn, that is, if there should be a microphone button underneath your name, and you can just click on that, and it should allow you to start talking. Oh. Which you have clicked on, but we don't hear you, unfortunately. I'll give you one more second to try, but otherwise you can type your message into chat if the audio fails. All right, why don't we go on Lucy, and then we'll come back and let Carrie try again in a second. Lucy, you want to talk?
Clicked on the slide rather than the microphone button.
Yep, there you go. Lucy, go ahead. Uh-oh, no audio from Lucy either. Oh, wait.
Double permission and need echo.
Yep.
What happens
Go
when
for
the
it.
legacy domain gets transferred to a new owner? Is that a security vulnerability?
Yeah. So if a domain gets transferred to a new owner, and I don't know if that would be like supposing one identity provider, were acquired by another. There would be certain security considerations with that. If a domain were taken, if a domain registration were lost and then acquired by, another entity, then those identities could be, that would definitely cause a problem here. So when you sort of break the link between the organization that's, that owns the domain, and another organization takes over, for good or ill, that would be something that's worth documenting as a security consideration, I think. It's a good point. Thank you.
To that question, right? There's the half of what happens when a taken over domain, changes control of what certificates are accepted by adding and removing names versus who owns the private key, which stays on the device. All right, that brings us to Carrie. Do you want to try again? All right, don't hear from Carrie. Come back, I guess, Carrie, when you want, or type your note into chat. In the meantime, I think we are at the end of clarifying questions, it looks like, at the moment. So we will dive into Charter next, which was the next item on our agenda. And
screwed up his grant decision on his microphone. Try once more. Don't grant, he says.
okay. All right, so back to the charter. So when we left our heroes, as were on the slides earlier, thank you, Michael, for looking at the timeline. The original charter that was proposed back in April, May. It's gone through a number of revisions with comments from various people that we've put into the GitHub page that is in Michael's GitHub account. This is essentially the charter. There's a number of things. I can read some of the slides, but some of the other ones are longer, and I'll let you read them for yourself. But really, the DANE authentication is for IoT service hardening. Working group seeks to extend DANE to encompass TLS client authentication using certificates or raw public keys. This is sort of the problem statement, so I will leave this here for a minute. One of the things that we're going for in a minute, and then I'll stop talking so you can read, but is, at the end of all of this, do people see any complaints with this text that would prevent the working group from being formed? So I will pause here for a minute.
Wes?
That's what?
So I guess I owe you some suggestions, which I haven't yet come up with, for even clearer statements. I don't think I'm disagreeing with the intent, but I think it could be stated better. So
Victor, I took your suggestions that you put on the list and I put them into
Right, it was pretty close. Yes, it's pretty close. I might yet do another pass at it.
Well, yeah. So here's the deal. We do not want to wait for your endless, twiddling with the text. So unless you have objections why this is absolutely fundamentally wrong, I don't want it to uphold the working group. We can change the charter after the working group is formed.
Okay, fine.
Okay, thank you.
It's close, so good enough. All right.
Good. Okay, thank you. So let's go on to the next page, which is more about the problem statement in part 2. And I will leave that there for a minute.
On this one, I'm not sure I understand who the private PKI issuer is. Is it the customer who purchased the devices or the separate providers who each separately enrolled them in their own PKIs? Because it's a little confusing.
Yeah, okay. So I think one of the biggest challenges that this working group has going forward is the problem space is lightly documented and is not, tuned down to. So one of the reasons that we added the architecture document to, the deliverables later was, and I apologize for using the word deliverable in the IETF, but to the charter items later was specifically to narrow this down with the timescale of, I think one of the first goals is really to better document the architecture with respect to who the players are, what are the examples that would make a good case scenario, which, you saw some in the slides, and other people, I think, in Jabber were suggesting, alternate, possible venues where something like this could be deployed. But we need to get those down to make sure that the resulting architecture that in the solution can actually meet all of the potential use cases. So I think that's a good question. Do you believe that the text as is needs to be clarified, or can we leave it somewhat generic with respect to where the private key PKI and the CA set is?
Here, I think the intended meaning is that the private PKIs are per provider, and that's why there's a communication gap. And yet it sounds like it's stated that the PKI is implemented by the user, where there won't be a communication gap. So it's a little confusing as it stands, as written, I think.
So the words application owners in the first thing is kind of implying that, yeah, that it was the heating cooling company or consultant, brought on one PKI, and then the lighting company brought in a different one. And whether those are outsourced or insourced, the point is that there were two different OT type people that were involved who set up boxes that for this, thing. And then 3 years later, you discover there's not really any way to communicate between them, right?
Right.
You don't get any heating, cooling savings because you can't turn the lights off when it's too warm, right?
Right. So application owners doesn't mean to me what is intended here. I thought it might be the user who owns all the apps. It ultimately, owns the deployment. But here you mean implementer, integrator, that kind of thing. I think it can be a little clearer. Yeah, I get what you mean.
It could be two people that sit at opposite ends of a the management organization. But
yes,
the point is that they didn't have a choice when they did this. The instructions said set up private PKI, so they did that, right?
Right. Okay. So multiple application owners, multiple private PKIs. All right. Not one private PKI. Okay. So I think a little bit more clarity on that would make it clear.
Maybe that word the word single private PKI is a problem.
Yeah. Something. Yeah.
Well, let's see if this works.
Intent is now clear.
Not saying to hear me talk. I'm perhaps too close to this particular use case. For me, the wording is
really quickly. That would
and
be a good
Victor's
thing.
maybe look at it with maybe this eye. This
all right,
particular
thank you, Victor.
Replicates all over, resulting in the two supply. Oh, don't hear me at all. Okay, then I'll just post to the list of the Jabber. Sorry.
Bob, your audio is. Audio was not any better, unfortunately. People are saying that it sounded the same as yesterday. Can you post your comment into Jabber, and somebody will read it off for you? In the meantime, I'm going to go on to the next slide, but we can come back to this just to let people read up. But we can come back to this when Bob posts its note. Of work section of where Danish should concentrate on. If we did discuss at the end of the last BOF, not to go overboard and not to do to find solutions for everything under the sun, but keep it down to primarily authenticating clients to infrastructure and not go into some of the more extravagant, possible other protocol modifications. Did say the use case text is really clear to him. I really appreciate that comment, but I think that he's too close to the problem, and that may be the case. But certainly support for wanting the problem solved is a good thing to hear today. Oh, Bill, you can go ahead.
Go ahead, Bill.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, there we go. Sorry, I just wanted to chime in and say that regardless of the IoT use case, the client authentication is really important to me, and I've got a lot of people sort of hung up on wanting TLS client authentication for DNS connections, so that by itself is completely sufficient justification for me.
Thanks for their feedback. So we are on
something that I think was just discussed in the chat about the relationship between this and SMTP start TLS client auth, and we don't have any words that say it's not for TLS or SMTP, but I also think that we just didn't want to, or at least I didn't want to make that a bike shed kind of issue. I think that's something that we would reasonably recharter if we needed to do that. That's my take on it, but I may not have the only view on that.
All right. Miyako is giving me a warning. Can you hear me, Michael?
I can hear you.
All right, thank you, Jacques. All right. So I think there's a number of ways that we can take this, conversation. We definitely want to hear from people that want to support the work. We want to hear from people that, probably think it's the wrong direction because this is a BOF after all. But hold on, Victor, before we dive into the exact question next. I think the first question we need to tackle is actually the charter itself, right? That's where we left off last time, and that's where we left off on the mailing list. So before we dive into, technical feasibility of the various implementations, the real question in my mind is, are there any charter modifications that need to be made if this working group is forming? And that does not mean that if there are no modifications to be made, the working group will definitely be formed. That'll be up to Roman to sort of help us determine that consensus. But any remaining topic of conversation on the charter text itself and its scope. Victor?
Say that the charter as written, I think, is reasonably inclusive of SMTP client auth, and I would implement it per whatever drafts come out. I don't see any conflict with the text here with preventing MTA to MTA client auth, which should be put in.
Awesome. I love that we've actually heard multiple people say that they hope to do implementation. That actually solves one of our outstanding questions, including you, Victor. Jacques?
I just wanted to say that the way it's written, the goal of IoT device to do client to server authentication with TLS and full TLSA DNSSEC presumably validation with that is what we need to work on, and it's what we need right now. So it's good.
Okay, thank you, Jacques. And then Bill posted a note that I'll reread here, which is that I'm fine with what's there, but I guess I de-emphasize the IoT stuff to the degree necessary to make it clear that there are also a lot of other use cases. And I think that's actually a very fair comment. It seems to be that there's people chiming in with other use cases that they want to do. Really, if we take IoT out and leave it a little bit more directed toward just client TLS authentication, maybe that would be generic enough, where IoT would be one use case. And that caused a lot of people to stand up. That's good. Brendan.
I'm trying to understand exactly which class of IoT devices this is aimed at. And just to give the context for that, if this is working through DNSSEC, then that means there's going to have to be public key operations anytime that you try and form a new relationship with a new device. So that means that if you're talking about battery-powered IoT, you are burning device lifetime every time you do this. And given the refresh rate of DNSSEC, that means that you pretty much have to do it once a quarter. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's how it works. So that means that you are looking at prescribing devices which are not, powered on a coin cell. At least that's how it looks to me. So, I mean, personally, it looks to me in the battery-powered IoT space like gateways are the right answer for this. But I mean, maybe you're targeting a different class of IoT device. So I'd just like some clarification on that.
Ash, you have a response?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So the super lightweight stuff, I don't really expect to, very often those won't even be establishing TLS connections, right? And so if you're talking about, the decoupled use cases, where you may have something that uses something like LoRaWAN for communication, I think you can do, some loose IP type communication over, but it's not the default, right? And so you're looking at something that beacons out, and they don't use public key encryption typically.
Well, I mean, this is what DTLS is for, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you establish a session and it lasts for a long time. So this is, I would expect a gateway type solution for this, where the gateway is a third party in the communication and it manages these interactions. And that's why we have DTLS with long-term connections.
Good point. We certainly don't want to, we want to include as much as we can, but I think for the stuff that's operated on a coin cell, this may not be ideal for that use case necessarily. It's a good point, and that's probably something we should work into the architecture doc.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Phil?
Hello, is it me?
Yep, you can hear you.
Yeah, so I think that you've got a really straightforward problem here that really fits Dane's capabilities very nicely, and one that just doesn't and is really complicated. I mean, like, client auth for SMTP start TLS, I think, is a no-brainer, and I just thought had been done in the first place. There's absolutely no reason why server search should be considered some really special type of certificate, because the only difference between client and server in the SMTP case is the client starts the conversation, the server responds, but they're using DNS names to identify things on both ends. And so that's something that makes perfect sense to me. Now, the IoT world, on the other hand, I mean, like, it's not at all clear to me that that DNS is a good fit. DNSSEC looks like a really poor fit. PKIX looks like a really poor fit. And we're trying to match all these together and that's a really, really complicated endeavor. And I think that if you're going to go ahead with this, do the TLS client auth first, because we're going to need that anyway, and make the IoT stuff. I mean, if they recharter and if they, but even then, I mean, like, that's just not the way that I would do this problem at all.
Comment? That's a valid constructive criticism. Ben?
Hi. So, yeah, I'm not sure about this 90-day limit that was alluded to. I'd be curious where that concept comes from. But it does seem like Dane has the interesting property that the validity of your identity is limited by the minimum of the validity lifetimes of all of the names above you in the DNS hierarchy, of all the zone cuts above you. So at a minimum, the root has very long validity lifetimes, but I don't know what the TLD DNS key lifetimes look like. That's presumably your limiting factor. For this charter, the thing that seems that I'd like to see addressed here is mixed deployments. So in general with Dane, if you're presented with with a DNS name and you know that you're in a Dane context, then Dane works very well. And in my view, the biggest problem that Dane has had is that if you're presented with a DNS name and you don't know whether you are supposed to do Dane, then Dane does not work really at all. And so in the web, where there's a pre-existing PKI in play, the Dane doesn't work well because you don't know whether you're supposed to use Dane when you're in the process of looking at a name. I think that a similar problem applies here, where you have names that you have pre-existing deployments of various kinds of, whether we're talking about TLS client auth or IoT applications. You have pre-existing deployments. They have their own identity systems. In some cases, those identities are DNS names, in which case they're not using Dane today, and you need to somehow interoperate with them. And in some cases, those identities aren't even DNS names at all. So I would like to see that addressed in the charter, either to rule it out and say that this is strictly limited to greenfield applications where you can be Dane only from the ground up, or to say that we're really going to try to figure out what you do when it's not initially clear whether Dane is in use. Thank you.
So if I can summarize that, you want to be very explicit about the different authentication realms that might be mixed or standalone in isolation. Is that sort of the recap?
So structure in terms of solutions, I think that if you wanted to support this, what you'd need is some kind of agreement, for example, on the format of a name, where names of a particular format are guaranteed to are indicated that as using Dane. And maybe that means that your identities aren't as simple as DNS names. Maybe your identity looks more like a URI, so that there's something else in there that can be a flag to say yes, and use Dane to validate this. But for the charter, yes, I think we just need to be clear about scope.
Okay, so I'll call into question whether that scope is necessary in order to be productive, but I won't speak my own opinion on that. We'll let others talk. Daniel, DKG.
Victor, I'm not sure if you can hear me. I think Victor said he wanted to answer Ben's question, so I'd let him go first.
Okay, Victor, go ahead.
Sure. So Ben was asking about knowing when to use Dane. and it's pretty explicit. You use Dane when there are TLSA records published, which can even specify whether to use Dane alone or whether to use Dane in combination with the Web PKI via the PKIX usages rather than the Dane usages. So Dane usage is self-discoverable, and without downgrade, at least if you trust DNSSEC, you have a denial of existence protection in DNSSEC. So it's a downgrade-free mechanism for discovering when Dane can and should be used. And the naming is all specified, at least for servers, _port_protocol, TCP or UDP, .fqdn. If that's published, then you use Dane. It's pretty straightforward. That's how it works in SMTP, where it's not a priori known whether to use it or not. Dane is used opportunistically by discovering whether it's applicable. So that question solves itself. And it can solve itself in additional contexts, including in the web. The main obstacle to using Dane in the web have been objections about latency and also about availability of DNSSEC in various captive portal or broken home CPE or various other environments where clients rather than servers find themselves with crippled DNS. So there are issues on that front, but not issues around discovering whether Dane applies. I also wanted to comment on the battery-powered thingy, but maybe I should let DKG speak first, since he let me just answer this question.
I think Ben has a response to your. I think Ben has a response to your response.
Hi. So, I mean, I understand that, but I think that the things get a lot more complicated. First of all, when private PKIs are in play, because private PKIs are typically configured to override other forms of authentication. They have priority, and so there's a priority conflict between Dane and your private PKI. And also because you may have a pre-existing system where the identities in play aren't actually DNS names. And so that we have a typing question. If you just are presented with a string, how do you know if it's a DNS name?
Local policy.
So I think this is beginning to smell a bit like a rat hole. It's a good rat hole. But I'm questioning whether we need to go into this level of detail today. The real question is, I think that, Ben, you've definitely pointed out something that we need to talk about during the working group actually getting work done. But I'm not sure that we need to talk about it today in order to get a charter agreement. Feel free to correct me if you think I'm wrong. Otherwise, DKG?
Hi, Daniel Gilmore. So as I see it, the main challenge for Dane in TLS is just that the server doesn't know what name the client is using, right? So in some sense, all we're saying here is that we want a way that the client can say, hey, here's my DNS name, and then you can check my certificate against this in the same way that I, as a client, would have checked if I was using Dane, I would have checked your name, right? Is that the core piece?
I think that's detail on that, and I apologize. I kind of glossed over that portion, but that's actually discussed in the drafts, and that as far as how we update the TLS handshake so that the client can signal that it intends to authenticate using Dane, and then the server says, okay, well, give me your Dane credential. And so it requires updates to the TLS handshake in order to support it so that you can, specifically authenticate using Dane, and it's not necessarily implicit.
But so the update to the handshake is basically an extension, right? It's a standard TLS extension. You're not talking about updating the handshake further than that.
Right.
Yeah, just adding an extension. Yeah.
Yeah. So the one additional wrinkle that I wanted to mention here is that this is now a client getting to force the server to do a particular DNS lookup. And I don't know whether there are any additional privacy concerns there in terms of identifying, say, public-facing view, or tracking the server down in a different way, right? The server may have a different address publicly than the client is contacting it on. So I just think you're basically forcing a lookup from server side that wouldn't necessarily otherwise happen. So I just think we should keep in mind there may be some additional privacy wrinkle there.
And I think that the authors of the draft look forward to your security considerations text that you'll provide them about that. That would be wonderful.
I will try to do that.
That's a good point, but again, probably into solution space rather than getting working group off the ground space. Rich?
Yeah, tell me if this is out of line for this point. I think we should not do this, and I don't think it's deployable. And do you want to have that kind of discussion now, or have the fans work on the charter?
So fundamentally, you object to the charter and the working group. Is that correct?
I think what will happen is that this is not deployable. I think on the one hand, so in order to do client identities, that means there has to be a client name in DNS somewhere. And that means, correct me if I'm wrong, since I'm kind of not totally up on all the Dane stuff, but if you have to have a client name and it's either a large manufacturing company, let's say Carrier, doing air coolers or chillers in data centers, or it's a small, somebody like Philip wants to automate their home system. We said, PKI is too hard, so instead we're going to add keys and certificates to DNS to people who are not experts. Not only not experts, really unfamiliar with this stuff, right? Because how else am I going to find out the name from my chiller and the key for the chiller if I want to tell it to stop cooling because there's an earthquake coming in, I don't want the power load. Only experts are using PKI. No, they're not. And I don't think we should continue to make it more than, I don't know. I just think it's going to end up being not deployable, and that's it.
Okay. I think deployability is an absolutely fair comment. So hold on. I don't want to dive down into into the solution space. So if you read the draft, the draft does discuss how to construct naming and things like that, and I think that is a valid concern that that deployability is something that should be mandatory toward the end. Is it deployable in large systems? Do manufacturers have to publish a TLSA record for every single one of the devices they ever create? DNS has been a rather deployable protocol, so it's certainly potentially possible. But let's go on, Victor.
A couple of comments. One, I wanted to return to the DTLS and battery device. Dane would only be used on initial session creation in TLS, right? When we're doing TLS resumption, which was the use case of a long-running DTLS session. Resumption doesn't exchange certificates, doesn't exchange public keys in TLS. So if you managed to establish 3 years ago a DTLS session that's still running, it will continue to work exactly the same way with or without Dane. Nothing about Dane changes the ability to resume already agreed TLS session keys. So if you're able to do TLS at all, and you're avoiding PKI by doing resumption forever, they'll continue to work. To Rich's point, I'm also a bit skeptical about deployment with respect to IoT, which is why I asked my earlier questions about whether anybody's planning to do this. But certainly for SMTP client, we have natural MTA to MTA. We already are in the DNS namespace. You announce your DNS name in the hello. We were going to do this in the Dane working group when it abruptly got shut down on me while Schumann and I were contemplating the Dane client draft now about 7 years ago, and it kind of ran out of steam when the working group closed. So it's 7 years overdue. That was already interested in it back then. So if that's all we end up doing, we end up finishing something.
The IETF is very good at letting big pauses get in the way of work. Jacques?
Deployability. GSMA is working on a IoT safe framework, and that's for the deployment of 5G IoT devices or mobile IoT device. So any mobile device, IoT device that has an eSIM, the IoT Safe is about building a framework to push on-demand credentials on IoT devices. And Danish, having TLSA records for client identity in the DNS is exactly what we need to make IoT Safe scale at the levels they want to do for 5G deployment. So it's very relevant for our, and then we actually have about 100 devices that are deployed today with this.
Yeah, I will say that the number of people that said that they're thinking about implementing it or have talked about deploying it sort of pushes back a little bit on it's not deployable, because clearly people have ideas on how to pull that off. But that's a good, again, future discussion for ensuring deployability happens or solutions in that space. Bill?
Address Rich's point about deployability. I don't see that as an issue. Obviously, one can find use cases that are inappropriate for anything. This is a DNS technique which will be invaluable for people who are capable of doing DNS. It is not difficult by DNS standards. Likewise, anybody who can set up an email server can easily do this. Yes, this is not intended for someone who buys a heater to go and set up DNS records and do DNSSEC signing. That is not the use case. The use case would be for the manufacturer to do that, not for end users to do that. End user hobbyists who are capable of running their own mail servers and running their own DNS servers, sure, but they're not a problem.
Hey, Timothy. Thank you. Timothy?
Yeah, Tim Panton. I think if we're going to do the IoT part of this and kind of emphasize it in the charter, we need to try and understand how it relates to Matter, which, if I understand it correctly, is addressing some of the same kind of onboarding from multiple manufacturers and generating a trust tree between devices from multiple manufacturers. So, and I think we need to either make clear blue water or collaborate or something, but we need to understand what our relationship is with that.
Ash, do you have a response to that at all?
I'm not deeply familiar with Matter and the way that it's put together, but my understanding is that it does operate a private PKI, and there are onboarding processes with that as well. I don't see this as something that's incompatible with that, but I don't know what I don't have off the top of my head what an integration avenue would look like for that. Open to feedback, and maybe that's something that that we could contextualize in the architecture document.
Dan Harkins nicely posted that Matter is a closed protocol from a vendor consortium, which does definitely play differently than the IETF space. Brendan?
Yeah, referring back to Victor's comment about session resumption, the point I was making was that each relationship that you have with another device, in a one-to-many or many-to-many kind of topology, is going to require that initial resolution, and that initial resolution costs you energy. Whereas if you use something like the gateway solution that I referred to, you end up with a one-to-many or many-to-many relationship with a single instance of PKI resolution or session establishment, and that does make a difference. So it wasn't necessarily about establishing connections many times. It was more about establishing many different connections.
So I don't think that you're arguing against that something like Danish wouldn't be bad. It's just that you want to highlight the fact that gateway-based solutions are equally as valid for some problem spaces.
Well, and indeed, that what they accomplish is a reduction in complexity in your end devices. I mean, we haven't even talked about what happens when nodes disappear to the relationships that have been established, and the complexity that you have to put into your end nodes in order to account for, I have a furnace and suddenly it can't find my thermostat anymore. What do I do? So that's a complexity that you have to put in the end node. And the question, if you're doing a direct device-to-device communication, so the question is, how does that get handled? And what kind of complexity and what kind of extra expense do you put into your devices to account for that?
All right. So thank you for the comment. I think a complexity trade-off, discussion in the future would be potentially a good thing, but I think there's probably multiple sides of that. Ben, you're next.
Hi, Ben Schwartz, Google. So I want the Dane client draft, and I want the DNS Exchange extension draft, and so I support chartering for those things. But for the IoT case, I worry actually that this charter could be harmful to users because it creates a planned obsolescence dynamic where I know my devices by name, and that name goes up to their manufacturer, which means that if the manufacturer goes out of business or just loses interest in maintaining a product line, and those DNS names drop off the net, my devices become inaccessible to me, even though they're on my local network. We saw the slide earlier about avoiding a trombone through the service provider. And while this avoids the trombone on every single connection or every single authentication step, it doesn't actually avoid that external dependency on device lifetime. So I think that we one thing that would make me happier here is if the charter, explicitly wrote in a requirement to essentially address orphan devices, ensure that orphan devices continue to be accessible and functional, or that users have a mechanism to tear their device out of the manufacturer ecosystem and point it at their own infrastructure.
So that sounds like a item that should go into the architecture document in terms of what's the longevity of devices in general or manufacturers in general, and that seems like an absolute.
I think that it's a charter item because it generates substantial technical work. For example, it might generate some technical components that resemble something around the domain connector or the CDS record, the systems that we have for trying to manage a parent zone. I think it's not trivial to make IoT devices retargetable, to say, okay, now your controller is no longer the original manufacturer. It's a big project, and but I think that has to be in charter if we want to pursue this.
All right. I thank you for your point. I would say that Danish is not the only place with that problem, though. But fair point. Phil.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in the chat, there's a lot of discussion about, is this limited to TLS? And one of the things to remember about Dane is that it is two things. It is a way to publish keys, and it is also a way to publish security policy, in that it is must use TLS to connect to this website. And the conflation of the two is unfortunate. It's something I argued against, but it is there. It will be useful if there is going to be a working group chartered. It will be useful to see that dismantled and separating out a way of expressing security policy that isn't constrained to just TLS. The other big problem with TLSA records is that I've not found any provider of DNS services that has a cPanel interface that allows me to input a TLSA record. I've got quad A, CAA, which I wrote 10 years ago, CNAME, MX, NS, SRV, SPF, TXT, and that is it. And for a very large number of internet admins, that is the entire palette of records they have available. It is now a decade since Dane has finished. So expecting TLSA records to be deployed by the DNS registrar community, that boat has sailed. So I think that if you're going to reopen it, you also have to question, are you going to tie yourself forever to that TLSA record, which I'm pretty sure was inserted into the working group as a boat anchor to cripple it, to be frank.
So a couple of things, Phil. One, TLSA records do not mandate that you use TLS except for the SMTP case. It was actually explicitly excluded in the TLSA draft itself that it was not allowed to indicate you must use TLS. That's a bit of history. It is mandated for SMTP, but it's not for HTTP, for example. As for cPanel and things like that, it sounds like you should do it if you did the other ones, so you could actually fix that problem for us. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, I can tell you there are reasons why I could get CAA in there, but couldn't get Dane in there, and they have to do with the business relationships. And I can't do it anymore because nobody's employing me in the CAA industry anymore. I've got no say there. I don't have those contacts anymore.
So with respect to does it need to be in cPanel or not, is a totally separate question, because there's a huge amount of TLSA records that exist on the internet, as Victor has proven through a lot of scanning. So your point is valid that for an end user needing to use this solution, this could be a problem. You're absolutely right. I don't think that's the target audience space of this particular group, though. All right, so Victor, I think you're next.
To Philip's comment, the Dutch standards organizations are now working with cPanel and so on to, in fact, directly address that question. So I expect to see work not too far into the future to make TLSA records available to end users. They've already been sending me questions about best practices. So we should see something in that space before too long, barring unexpected obstacles. So I think even though it's taken 10 years, for lack of adoption in browsers, one can understand why the pressure to adopt has been quite light. But with SMTP deployments expanding, people are interested in having cPanel support for users of mail servers and the like. So I think that can change, and if we add more use cases, the incentives will go up. Barring incentives, nobody will do it. So some things take time to be current and relevant, and so we will see. It's a solvable problem. I was going to say something else important, but I now forgot. So I'll come back to the queue when I remember.
Well, you're in the queue.
I wanted to understand Phil's comment better. As far as I can understand, the only reason I would need a TLSA record in my cPanel is if I was using it for SMTP uses. I can't understand when otherwise. Now, Phil writes, if I can't take control of the device, I don't want this at all. Well, that's not, I think that is completely out of scope, because none of the other systems are promising you to take control of the device. So I'm all for taking control of the device, but I don't see how this helps you one way or the other. So I don't think it matters that you have cPanel access or not, because it's the manufacturer that has to put this name in. If you want control of the device, then buy a device that's you on board. And I also wanted to say something about chip matter, and I couldn't say it because my microphone broke. So the spec is not public, and my impression from what I've understood about from Ash and Schumann is that the target use case is definitely outside of the home, and it is at a different scale of things that really doesn't have a lot of overlap with matter, even if we think that home devices will round up in hair salons. They're not going to be running, as I wrote, the Chrysler building. That's my take, my understanding of it, but I could be corrected.
Okay, thanks, Victor.
On the topic of the DNSSEC chain extension, that will be RFC 9102, published any day now through the independent stream. we've finally gotten it wrapped up. It's in Auth 48 today and should be done, within a week or however long Auth 48 takes. So RFC 9102, look to read it soon.
Thanks for the update. All right, with that, we've drained the queue. So what I would like to hear from next is there's certainly a lot of interest within the audience as far as my read goes. There's a few people that are critical of it, and it makes perfect sense, and there's a few people that have pointed out technical difficulties and things that we need to overcome. So Roman, a quick call out to you. If there's things you definitely want to hear from next, please let me know. Oh, you already were typing. I'll get back to that in a second. What I'd like to hear from in the meantime is who is willing to work in this space. And, there have been some people that have spoke up that have wanted to implement, but, do we have enough forward movement within people that are willing to participate and review and participate in mailing list discussions and things like that and implement? Anybody have comments with respect to that in terms of desire to move this work forward? Assuming, we agree on all the charter text at some point. Victor?
I don't know anything about IoT.
Well, so this is, potentially one of the considerations was we make this a little bit more generic and talk more generic about client-related stuff, of which IoT falls into that. So. Roman?
Note, there are a couple of parties that definitely have voiced we should use less IoT words. We should generalize that. That can make kind of perfect sense. I guess I'm trying to understand how much that's technical. We need better technical constraints, and how much of that is editorial. So the thing that would be interesting for me would be, for a second, let's ignore everything above the work items. Let's stare at the work items. Is there something too IoT specific in there that wouldn't allow for a general, kind of the general use patterns we discussed?
Okay, Bill? Don't hear you yet, Bill.
No. So again, I've got nothing against IoT folks, and more power to them if they can find ways of applying this and solving problems and so forth. I just need this for DNS, and I would love to have it available for the SMTP folks as well. And so I just don't see a reason to throw IoT specific references into a general purpose technology that we all need, because that's just going to get IoT rat hole conversations tying up the work. I think we need to move forward with the actual work. IoT folks may need standardization around how to apply that in their specific space, addressing their issues of coin cell batteries and so forth. None of that matters to me, and I don't need to spend any of my attention on that. I just need this for DNS.
Okay, thank you very much. And I do note that a large number of people, a 5 to 10 number of people have spoken up in the chat indicating support and things that you're willing to do. We appreciate that very, very greatly, including renaming the working group. Victor.
Yeah, so I see this as being two pieces of work. One is sort of a base document, just specifying a little bit of how to publish client TLSA records and various special use labels for that and all of that kind of fun. And that's general and cuts across the board. IoT, not IoT, doesn't matter, and that's what Bill is addressing. But if this is to actually then be applicable for IoT, then all of the sorts of questions about device longevity, and is my manufacturer still around, and are there gateways and so on, in fact becomes very germane. And so if that's also in scope for this working group, then the higher level issues around IoT are serious and come into play. So I don't know whether it makes sense to do first the kind of basic technology and then IoT, follow on it, whether to them concurrently. How to structure the working group in terms of work items. Do we carry these out in parallel or serially? Is kind of, I think, where Bill is, in some sense, kind of asking the question.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Dan Harkins, for getting that song stuck in my head. Wonderful. Jacques?
I'm gonna sing that song, but I can't for the life of me sing. So I like dance. The IoT part is causing an issue here. Like Bill said, I support this. But we need to have client server mutual TLS connection, 100% DNSSEC. We need that, irrespective of IoT device or whatever. So +1 for dancing.
All right, Phil?
In agreement. Basically, it seems like a no-brainer to me that if you can charter the working group around extensions that will be servicing SMTP start TLS, that's going to be a much more constrained and tight and narrow charter than one that is trying to solve IoT. If you're looking to solve IoT, if you produce me a requirements, I would like to participate to be in a requirements for IoT. But the solution that I've got in mind and running in code doesn't involve DANE or DNS at all. And I just don't see that they're relevant to solving the types of problems that I see in IoT. And so I think it's really two working groups, one of which you can charter now. And if we're going to do an IoT group, I mean, yeah, that'd be a good thing to do. But why tie it to this particular technology when it may not be the one that is appropriate to the IoT problem?
So let me stop for 1 second and say that I think that there is general consensus in the room based on all of the comments and reading of the text that we will remove IoT from the charter and make it more client-specific oriented. I don't think we will tie it directly to SMTP client authentication. That is way too narrow based on, I think, all of the comments that we've heard today. So my plan is that we will do some wordsmithing, and we can even do it live, as Roman thought about as well, to remove some of the wording around IoT device and really tie it toward client identity. And then we'll need to do that wordsmithing, basically. All right, I think that's sort of the end of the list of questions that I in particular want to pose. There definitely seems to be support for, based on my random Boff chair reading of lots of interest in people continuing on the work for this. So Roman, is there anything else you want to hear from us? I'd be happy to shift into live text editing, but I kind of want to wrap up the exciting parts before we do something like that.
No, I mean, I would concur exactly with your summary. I hear that there's support for the work items. There's some concerns about the framing, and it sounds like depending on the choice of the framing, for example, if IoT is chosen, there's a desire to put additional constraints on what that solution space would look like. I don't know, but it would seem like if that specific application domain was removed, perhaps the need for additional constraints in the charter would be removed, and that might be easier to move forward. I also like some of the suggestions I've heard with multiple speakers that we shouldn't be overly ambitious. We can recharter as we want more, but if we could start we could start from a core body of work we all agree on, and then we can incrementally add more scope. I prefer that just so we get started on the work.
Fair. Can you give us some words of warning with respect to what happens if we refuse to work on a charter on the mailing list, or thoughts on what we should have as a deadline for getting a charter approved by everybody?
Sure.
Do you see that bus coming?
Sure. I mean, we don't want to. So listen, we had a BOF last time, and we walked out of it, and there was general excitement about we thought we understood the problem. Then we got to the specifics of the charter. We tried to pull it in every kind of direction, and we heard crickets, and we got no working group. We're entering the second time to kind of talk about the BOF. I think we need to set aside potentially all the dimensionality of this and find what the MVP would be that we all can agree on and make some progress here. And then based on that experience, we figure out what additional scope we want.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have, I guess, from an open mic, point of view, things that you think that we should definitely, we have missed discussing today that is important before the formation of a working group? And I'll give a few minutes for that. And then I think we will shift into, we'll do some wordsmithing on the charter live. We still have a half an hour left. And that's always good fun. But that may let some of the 112 people that might be bored watching charter text fly across the screen. Victor?
I have a question as to whether it should all be in scope to update 7671 a little bit with hindsight from 7 years of deployment experience. Should that be re-examined at all, or do we just assume it's close enough? It's not so bad, but there are things I wish I would have done differently.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly I understand that viewpoint. My read of how hard that would be dangerous to try and undertake revamping the server side too, and that I suspect that a future 7671 BIS might come out and could go into a future charter. But I think if we try and tackle that along with client-side Dane, could be problematic. But you're right, we could also run the risk of needing to violate 7671 at the same time, or past documents. And I think we'll, Roman?
Kind of support exactly what you said, Wes. What we were talking about here is a client side. Let's focus on client side. If it turns out we are engineering our way and we realize, oh no, we really cannot continue based on the constraints we all agree on, and we got to touch the server side, let's revisit that, potentially with a recharter exercise. But the going in position of opening up the server side, I think we will definitely struggle to come up with a manageable scope.
Okay, great. Any other last comments? All right. Roman, you owe me for this. All right, so so if we were going to remove IoT, so for those that don't want to help actually wordsmith charter text and fight over minor word changes, feel free to leave. I appreciate your attendance, and I appreciate, we all appreciate your attendance, and especially for those that spoke up, willing to support. For those that do like committee-based wordsmithing, stick around. All right, we still have a half an hour left, and we can probably get through some of this.
After we do a little bit of committee-based wordsmithing, I mean, I would like to ask the participants that are here what they think of that. That would be a strong signal if we could exit kind of this meeting with some text that we all agree on here.
Yep. I think the people that care about the wordsmithing will stick around and give you support. So I'm going to leave off the whole renaming thing. I think that we will come back to that. So with respect to whether IoT is in the title or not is probably beyond scope for what we want to handle in the next 30 minutes. And Roman and Michael and I will kibosh afterwards about whether that's a good thing to do. It's a very valid point. I do like dance, that works well. But I think Russ Housley brought up a point that renaming working groups can be a pain. So let's try and tackle the Internet of Things stuff first, because I think that that's what has caused the most discussion today with respect to things. So I will note that in the background, in the challenge, in response to the challenges related to the ambiguity between different CAs, named identities, issued by by two differently named CAs, for example, application owners frequently choose to onboard IoT device client identities. That is more a problem space. If we look down at the scope of work, IoT isn't mentioned anywhere, right? So maybe that's actually the right thing to do. I'm sorry for thinking out loud, but essentially, we should start from the bottom up, right? What is the scope of the work based on all the discussion that we just had? And we can morph sort of the top to include potentially more examples than IoT. As I think was discussed on the Jabber list, there's a lot of people that want to include IoT at least as an example, and I think that makes perfect reasonable sense. Is there people that want to make changes to any of these 5 sections of scope of work? Right, so we actually, the scope of work is actually pretty close to, I think, what we agreed upon, right, which is client authentication. Ben says keep as is. Thank you, Ben. Anybody else that thinks there are pieces of this that are wrong, broken, too specific, or too wide?
I think, Wes, if you want to work this way, then I think you need to ask if we need to have an IoT specific deliverable. You want to even go further down. The thing that I would imagine is having to find how to do all the TLS and how to do this other things that someone might wish to write an applicability statement, or maybe it's almost an architecture that basically captures the solution space that was examined by the taxi situation.
That's a good point. So maybe the architecture document, which has always been somewhat nebulously defined, right? So, Michael, is there any words, that we should add to architecture? Besides architecture, are we looking for framework examples? I'm blanking on sort of the right text there.
So we could, write into the title here, architecture for, and then, we've listed SMTP and IoT, and maybe that doesn't belong into this. Somebody else
Lost. We may have lost you for a second. You blinked out, but you're okay. So maybe architecture and examples, example deployment scenarios. I actually spelled that right. What do you know? Hank? What's your name right? I apologize.
Hi, this is Hank. So you are shying away from the term use case here deliberately. In that case, user scenarios or deployment scenarios are fine, but why not give a few example use cases at the start?
I concur.
Okay, so use cases. So things like IoT, SMTP, client.
Exactly. Yeah. These fields, and then I think actually, and I have to highlight that Hannes said that he would be happy to work with anybody with embed TLS on this. So that would be somehow complementing text writing with tangible things. So yeah, would be nice.
Ben, let's not be that specific, ideally. I think I understand your point, though.
That's complementary information, not for text.
Actually, I would be quite happy to have the word industrial IoT somewheres in the text here. I don't think it necessarily needs to go here, but I think that it definitely needs to go in the document. I think that would be helpful to, as people said, it's changing all the time. Well, industrial IoT is not changing that quickly.
Okay. Bill Woodcock, can I call you out specifically? Is there a particular, you said that you really wanted this and you ran a completely different type of infrastructure than a lot of what we're talking about today. Is there a particular use case you really want this for?
So the two big ones are for authoritative to authoritative server authentication of the receiving side. So a lot of people contractually require the receiver of a zone file, a zone transfer, to not let it go any further. A lot of people get really paranoid about zone enumeration and that kind of thing. TSIG keys are, everybody would like to move beyond TSIG keys. So what we need is, I mean, TSIG keys are great for what they are, and they got us a long ways, but
yeah.
So we need authoritative servers, the receiving zone transfers, to be able to authenticate themselves to the master servers, or sorry, whatever the new politically correct word for the originating authoritative server. And then the second case is recursive servers. So you got hundreds of millions of users out there using something, and we got to be able to distinguish between users and attackers. And we got to be able to distinguish between people who have paid their bill and not paid their bill. We got to be able to distinguish between people who are authorized users of a closed system and people who should get a different generic answer because they are on the outside. And all this has been radically accelerated by work from home and endpoint security models and all that.
Okay. So for the DNS side, I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave DNS out and just label server to server to make it a little more generic. Is that okay?
Well,
okay.
The recursive is stub to recursive or caching to recursive.
Yeah.
But again, I'm honestly not for naming all these use cases at this level. I think that's just sort of.
I was really looking for other ones we want to throw in these parentheses. So I think your server-to-server example is actually a reasonable one to throw in there. Victor?
Just SMTP client is server-to-server mostly, so it's really the same bucket in a sense. Special case off, but yeah.
Yeah, I was trying to leave out whether that was client-to-server or server-to-server intentionally, but fair point. So
generic.
All right.
I really, yeah.
Okay. So I think that we're good for deliverables. We don't need to change anything. We're talking about Dane for, these are really client certificates. So we'll change it from device to client to make it a little bit more generic, and then Dane for TLS client authentication. So those can be two separate drafts. Colin, oh, you went away.
You just solved my problem, so thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Colin. All right, scope of work. There was sort of some notes earlier. I'm going to go back to this, even though I'm not sure that there's anything to change. But for any of these texts, do we feel like things need to be improved upon here? There was other ones before that were in the chat saying leave as is. Okay, I don't. Victor?
Perhaps a little fuzzy. I'm not sure, but the future work may include. I think this is kind of still based on IoT as the initial work, but now that IoT is not the initial work, I'm not sure exactly what the fourth bullet should say.
Oh, okay.
Because it becomes more like. Yeah, go ahead.
Do we need it at all at this point?
This whole section?
No, we included the future work bullet previously to help us down scope to the three we have. If we all are saying, listen, we accept that we may have to recharter in the future, why do we have to list what we could potentially work on at some future date? I mean, we could have as wide of a scope as we want.
Yeah, well, we were trying to leave out the EAP and some of the other mechanisms that were truly next steps out. That was sort of the purpose behind this text originally. But Victor, is your hand still up? I didn't put it down. No, Jacques?
Client certificate, client keys. Could have public key that's represented in TLSA. So is it too specific?
I'm sorry, can you restate that starting from the beginning? I think I missed the first few words due to Meet Echo dropping you.
So Dane for TLS client certificate. It could be keys as well.
Okay, where are you wanting me to
The
add that?
deliverable there, or wherever it says certificates.
Oh, I see what you mean. So client certificate and keys. Is that what you mean? Okay. Dan? Still
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep, now we can.
Okay, thanks. So I'm good about future work, just alluding to other protocol services, but we should allow for links to be made to those other protocol services. And to that end, I kind of liked Dance because it was network clients everywhere, and now we're going back to adding TLS in front of everything. So can we have deliverables that are not necessarily for TLS client certificates?
So I think, Roman will hopefully back me up here. There is a certain amount of, if we try and reframe how to do all object signing, we'll end up spinning for a long time. And that doesn't mean that we can't reuse things. But so my personal belief is that wide of a charter where we just say we're going to authenticate any client to any server is a much more challenging problem to get wide agreement on, and that we should start specifically with TLS clients, because that's how Dane was designed. If we want to go back and do DNS object verification more generically, that's no longer Dane, right? Dane was specifically for TLS. So I guess my view is, and Roman, I would love to hear your AD's perspective on that, is that would be a little too wide to accomplish stuff on.
Yeah, I just put it in the charter. In the chat. I agree. I mean, I have a strong preference for us to consider something beyond TLS as a recharter exercise, not for the MVP right now.
Okay, Victor.
We do have Dane for things other than TLS already, only very experimental, right? We have the SMIME and OpenPGP Dane records. So there is some precedent for Dane beyond TLS, but no known deployment really. Although there are some people even using the OpenPGP and SMIME stuff. It's very narrowly. It didn't get off the ground really.
Wes, Ben has a proposal for client key management point 2.
Can you reframe? So am I supposed to replace the whole bullet with that? And I assume you mean this bullet. Can you speak up, Ben? Sorry, Shuman, 1 sec.
That's what I meant. The whole text there.
So before client key management practices for Dane.
Yeah, something like that.
Anybody object to me removing what is now in yellow for the proposed alternate text? Shuman, go ahead, will I?
Sure. So yeah, I'm going to comment on that in a minute, but I was going to follow up on the question about Dane being limited to TLS, but Victor beat me to it. I was going to point out this OpenPGP key and SMIME. So Dane is not really only about TLS. I mean, there are other use cases, but
well,
okay,
TLSA. So Dane defines TLSA records, right? So I mean, there are other record types for other keys.
Correct, but they're all considered under the broad category of Dane. So the TLSA record specifically to date is about TLS, right? But there are other Dane records. But on the deliverables, I was a little bit confused about. Can you scroll down those? Are those the 3 items, or? Okay, so I was a little bit confused about the difference between the Dane for TLS client certificates and keys and client authentication, and then it occurred to me later that here we're talking about the 2 current drafts, which are actually, the first one is Dane for TLS client authentication. The second was a TLS extension to convey Dane client identity. I think that's what was meant to be there originally. So I would advise putting that back in, because those are the 2 active drafts that we are trying to complete, right? And if there's other items we want to add there, that's fine with me. But I think those two things should be covered at the very least.
So like that, in other words.
Correct, yes.
Okay, that's a good point, because that's where it came out. All right, thank you, Shimon. Victor?
I think actually the third item should be reverted, right? We have because now we've lost the Dane client auth publishing in DNS and the like, right? So we have the client extension. No, but also the separate draft is in fact specifying how to publish. Is that what you mean by key management practices? To me, key management practices sounds like, lifetime and rollover rather than where it's published and how it's mapped to DNS. So, and that's separate from the TLS extension, right? So I think the bullet that you just changed earlier was covering, how to publish client-side TLSA records, essentially. And the TLS extension is a separate piece of work.
I do hesitate to actually be very prescriptive about what pieces go in what documents at this point, but I recognize that that's sort of what we've put down. I guess I'll let Ben speak before I give my thoughts.
Well, but you have only a TLS extension, but there's nothing covering the work to publish client key bindings in DNS. Where is that?
That would be in the client key management sections. But the question is where does authentication go?
Right. So just rename client key management, because to me key management sounds like rollover and the like, not actually publication and naming and and all of that fun stuff.
Yeah.
Okay,
so if I could quickly jump in, I just want to follow up on Victor's point. So the two drafts, the thing that Victor was pointing out is the original two drafts the first one was TLS client authentication via Dane TLSA records. That showed you how to publish client Dane TLSA records and use TLS to authenticate Dane clients. And the second was the TLS extension. So those are the two of the work items that we were originally planning to do. So the client key management practices, I think this is an additional item that Ben just proposed or someone just proposed, right? So we could add that in there, but I think the first two items that Victor pointed out have to be in there.
So the point being is that the first one was supposed to be publishing Dane records in DNS for clients, and the second one was a TLS extension to provide those names to servers. So that's the dumbed down text of what we're trying to accomplish, if I've followed everything correctly.
Yes, but I think the second item is a little bit misnamed because we don't talk about client key management practices in the TLS client authentication draft.
Yet, so remember, this is working group forming, meaning we may change, the scope of the original proposed drafts according to the needs of the working group. So, Ben,
okay.
I'd love to hear your thoughts, Ben.
Ben Schwartz. So I was just trying to reframe this line about device keys in a way that seemed to. I was trying to capture the intent behind that framing, but I may not have understood what the intent was. So for what it's worth, I think now I think both of them are misnamed. I think probably we need a deliverable for how to publish. How to publish Dane TLSA records. Let's be specific for clients. I think that's a deliverable.
Not proposed replacement text, but that's fine.
The TLS extension we're talking about is not required, right? Like the existing Dane as it exists today is totally sufficient. You don't need a TLS extension. The TLS extension is an optimization or possibly applicable in certain cases if you believe that the other endpoint can't do its own DNS lookups. And it's not client specific, at least. Not unless the draft has changed. It's actually equally applicable in both directions.
or the other endpoint is being man in the middle. Right, it's a recovery mechanism from that.
Well, so okay, the other endpoint is not able to. It avoids some denial of service attacks, I guess you could say. But that's not the main point from my perspective. So
Okay.
I think the things we actually want, yeah, the client key management thing. That was just me reading what I thought the charter said before. Generalized past, not for IoT.
Okay.
So I think that what we actually want here is very specific points. Like we want to deliver a protocol that allows TLS clients to identify themselves by Dane, and we want a TLS extension to deliver DNSSEC chains during Dane authentication.
Okay, I'm not sure there's wide agreement on that particular solution architecture. So
otherwise, there's no need for a TLS extension. That's
well,
the whole.
The extension was to name something that couldn't be derived in some other way, right? Was my understanding of the need for the extension. But I think that we're going to rat hole, and we don't really have enough time at this point to get through this. So let me run through the remaining people, and then I think that we're going to have to take the fine-tooth comb to the deliverables to the mailing list. Bill?
The whole key management thing from the sort of operator perspective, what I hear is everybody saying that there are two pieces to this. One is the ability to authenticate users once you've got a Dane record for them. The other is the ability to provision keys out to users. Two very separate problems. Everybody recognizes them as separate problems. Nobody wants to try and fix everything in one draft. And in principle, I am opposed to anything that slows down the two existing drafts. I would like to see those moving ahead as cleanly as possible. And so if we're wording the deliverables in ways that don't clearly match up with the work that's already well underway, that seems like a problem to me.
Interesting point. Okay, I understand that. Shuman?
So just to answer Ben Schwartz, the TLS extension, let's make sure we're talking about the right TLS extension. The TLS extension for Dane client identity is not always required, but could be required in certain circumstances. For example, if you're trying to do raw public key authentication, there's no client X509 certificate from which the client identity can be extracted, so you do need it there. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to point out. Thanks.
Okay, good point, Shuman. Thank you. Victor, you're going to get the last word of the day. Ooh, Victor just went offline. Nope, Victor's back. Victor, you get the last word. Victor may get the last word. He has 2 minutes to fix his microphone issues. All right. Well, hearing not Victor, I think we made a lot of progress, on the charter, even in the last half an hour. But clearly, we need more to be done. For the working group mailing list, we need concrete suggestions, not complaints, for what needs to be changed in the charter. So we will do a last round of charter bashing on the mailing list. Thank you all for coming, but we please, if you're going to talk about the charter, Please give specific proposals on what you need to change. We have edited this charter for far too long at this point, and the only way to make forward progress is not through complaining what is or good or bad, but rather this is what my proposed change is. So we'll take that to the mailing list. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Michael, for maintaining all of the more silent parts of this meeting, and thank you, Roman, for overseeing this conclusion of the BOF series that is known as Danish. Goodbye, everybody.